What happens when the most feared accountant in Chicago, a quiet, heavy-set woman who balances blood money for a living, becomes the one thing a cold-blooded crime lord refuses to lose? He thought she was invisible. She thought she was replaceable. They were both wrong. The back office of Carmine's steakhouse smelled like old ledger paper, cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls over 3 decades, and the particular kind of dread that settles into a room where money has been laundered so many times the bills practically know the cycle by heart. Rosalie Dunn had worked in that back office for 4 years, and she had learned to be invisible inside it. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and carried herself like a woman who had long ago made peace with taking up more space than the world preferred. She had soft brown eyes behind thick-framed glasses, dark hair she kept pinned back in a practical knot, and hands that were almost always stained faintly with ink from the old-fashioned ledger books she maintained by hand, because, as she had explained to her predecessor before he disappeared, a handwritten ledger couldn't be subpoenaed the same way a digital file could. Her predecessor had disappeared anyway, but that was a different story. Rosalie's job title on the extremely thin slice of paperwork that existed about her employment was Administrative Coordinator for Carmine's restaurant group. In reality, she was the forensic accountant who kept the Sorrento organization from hemorrhaging money, the IRS from asking inconvenient questions, and 7 different shell companies from accidentally collapsing into each other like a house of cards in a strong breeze. She was extraordinarily good at her job. No one ever said so out loud. In the Sorrento organization, competence was assumed and mistakes were punished. Gratitude was not part of the vocabulary. On a Tuesday in November, grey, cold, with sleet tapping against the single narrow window above her desk, Rosalie was reconciling a discrepancy in the 4th quarter revenue reports when the door to the back office opened without a knock. She didn't look up. Knocking was not a tradition that the men who worked for the Sorrento family had ever bothered to observe. She simply kept her pen moving, finished her notation, and waited. Done. That was new. Most of the men who came through her office either ignored her entirely or called her the numbers lady. The fact that this person knew her name made her look up. The man standing in the doorway was someone she recognized by reputation before she registered his face. Felix Caruso, not a Sorrento by blood, but by authority he might as well have been. He was the head of the organization's security operations, a former military man with close-cropped grey at his temples and the kind of posture that made rooms feel smaller. He was 43 and moved like a person who had never once in his life been surprised. "The boss wants to see you," Felix said. Rosalie took off her glasses and set them carefully on the ledger. "Which boss?" Felix's expression didn't change. "The only one that matters." She had never met Adrian Sorrento. In 4 years of working for the organization, she had operated entirely through intermediaries. Reports went to Felix. Questions came back through Felix. She had seen Adrian Sorrento exactly twice. Once through the window of her office when he came to Carmine's for a late dinner, and once at a distance in the parking garage when she was leaving at midnight after fixing an error that had taken her 11 hours to untangle. Both times, he had not seen her. She was very good at not being seen. She stood up, smoothed the front of her dark blazer over her hips, and followed Felix out of the office. The main dining room of Carmine's at 9 in the evening was the controlled theater of organized wealth. White tablecloths, low lighting, a piano player in the corner running through something Italian and melancholy. The room was half full of people who either worked for the Sorrento organization or wanted to. Nobody looked at Rosalie as she crossed the room behind Felix. She was invisible here, the same way she was everywhere. A heavy-set woman in a plain blazer, not glamorous enough to notice, not small enough to overlook entirely, just perpetually, exhaustingly in between. Felix stopped at a corner booth set apart from the others, by a subtle arrangement of privacy screens. He stepped aside without a word. Adrian Sorrento was reading a document when she approached. He didn't look up immediately, which gave Rosalie approximately 4 seconds to study the man she had spent 4 years working for without ever speaking to. He was not what she had expected, though she would have had difficulty articulating what she had expected. He was lean and dark-haired with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something expensive and then left in the cold too long. Handsome in a way that had gone austere. He was wearing a charcoal suit. No tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button. The casualness of it felt calculated. Everything about him felt calculated. He looked up. His eyes were a very pale grey, almost silver, and they landed on Rosalie with the immediate, assessing quality of someone who processed information the way she processed numbers. Fast, precise, and without sentiment. "Sit down, Miss Dunn," he said. His voice was quiet, not the loud, chest-forward authority of men who needed to remind rooms of their power. Just very, very certain of itself. Rosalie sat. "I've been looking at the Meridian Holdings restructure," Adrian said, sliding the document across the table. "Walk me through your reasoning on columns 14 through 19. She hadn't brought her glasses. She leaned forward slightly and read the numbers anyway, because she had written them and she knew them by heart. The depreciation schedule on the restaurant equipment was running accelerated, she said, which is legal, but it was front-loading the deductions in a way that would flag an audit if anyone ran a comparative analysis against the industry average. I stretched it back to straight line over 7 years. It costs us roughly $60,000 in deferred deductions over the next 3 years, but it keeps the ratio inside the normal range. Adrian studied her. And the net tax exposure, reduced by approximately $240,000 annually once the restructure settles. The $60,000 is a rounding error. Silence. He looked at the document, then back at her. "Felix tells me you found the Hargrove discrepancy," Adrian said. The Hargrove discrepancy had been a $300,000 variance buried inside 7 layers of intercompany transactions, hidden well enough that the previous accountant, the one who had disappeared, had missed it for 2 years. Rosalie had found it in her 3rd week on the job and said nothing to anyone except Felix, because she had immediately understood that announcing she'd found it too loudly might raise questions about why it had taken 2 years. "I found it," she said carefully. "Do you know who put it there?" The question was quiet and entirely without inflection, the kind of question that had an answer built into it, waiting for her to catch up. "I have a theory," Rosalie said. "Tell me," she told him. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, in sequence, with the numbers doing the narrative work, without editorializing. When she was finished, Adrian Sorrento leaned back in the booth and looked at her with that silver-grey gaze for a long moment. "You've been here 4 years," he said. "Yes. And you've never asked for a raise." She hadn't. She had simply made sure her initial contract included performance escalators tied to measurable outcomes, which had quietly tripled her salary without requiring her to ask anyone for anything. "I structured my compensation to adjust automatically," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the ghost of one, or the idea of one, living in a face that had forgotten how they worked. "You're very good," he said. "I know," Rosalie said. She had not intended to say it. The words came out before she could route them through the filter she usually kept running at all times. The one that reminded her to be small, to be invisible, to keep her head down, and not make herself a target. She felt her face go warm. Adrian Sorrento looked at her for another long moment. "Come back Thursday," he said. "Bring the Whitfield account files." She stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked back across the dining room. She was invisible again by the time she reached the hallway, but somewhere between the corner booth and the back office, she became aware of something that hadn't been there before. The distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. She didn't look back. She should have looked back. Thursday became a standing appointment, not by formal declaration. Nothing in the Sorrento organization was ever formally declared, but by the simple gravitational logic of the fact that Adrian kept calling her back. They went through the Whitfield account, then the Marchetti Holdings filings, then the complex web of offshore entities that technically belonged to an umbrella company, registered in Delaware, that technically belonged to a holding company in Cyprus, that technically didn't exist. Rosalie untangled it all with the calm efficiency of a woman diffusing something she understood better than the person who had built it. She started to understand him, too. Slowly, the way you come to understand a cipher, not by forcing it, but by reading the pattern beneath the surface. Adrian Sorrento did not waste words. He asked precise questions and expected precise answers. And the one time a junior associate had sat in on their Thursday session and offered an approximation instead of a number, Adrian had looked at him with those pale eyes until the man had visibly reconsidered his entire career. He had a particular stillness that was not patience, but something colder. The stillness of a person who was always thinking several moves ahead and had decided to let the current moment catch up to him. What Rosalie hadn't expected was that he listened, completely, without interruption, with the kind of focused attention that she had spent her entire professional life performing for other people and almost never receiving. When she was walking him through a reconciliation or explaining a structural risk, he didn't look at his phone. He didn't look past her. He looked at her. It was profoundly disorienting. The other thing she hadn't expected was Marco Bellini. Marco was the organization's senior financial officer, Rosalie's nominal superior, though in practice she did 3/4 of his job, and he took the credit and the salary differential that came with having the title. He was 48, thick-necked, and had survived in the Sorrento organization for 12 years through a combination of political skill and strategic loyalty that had nothing to do with understanding balance sheets. He noticed around week 4 of the Thursday sessions that Rosalie was being called in to meet directly with Adrian, and Marco Bellini, who had spent 12 years ensuring that his own access to the boss was carefully controlled and that no one beneath him in the hierarchy ever became visible enough to threaten it, did not like that at all. It started subtly. Files she needed would be misfiled or delayed. Reports that should have reached her by Monday would arrive Wednesday. Once, a set of source documents she needed for the Cyprus reconciliation simply vanished from her desk and reappeared, slightly out of order, in the filing cabinet 3 days later. Nothing she could point to. Everything with plausible deniability. Then, on a cold Thursday in January, Marco called her into his office before her session with Adrian. "The Whitfield reporting structure," he said, sliding a document across his desk. "I've restructured it. Going forward, all analysis routes through me before it goes upstairs." Rosalie looked at the document. That adds 3 to 5 days to the turnaround on every report. That's the new process. That's going to create lag in the quarterly projections. Marco leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has decided to remind a woman of her place without technically saying anything she could repeat to anyone. "You're a very smart girl, Rosalie. You do good work. But you're getting a little overextended. A very smart girl." She was 31 years old with 2 advanced degrees, and she had just saved his organization $240,000 annually, and she was a very smart girl. "Understood," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. She went to her office, closed the door, and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk, breathing carefully through her nose. Then she opened her calendar and moved the source documents she needed into a parallel filing system she maintained independently of the main office records. She had started doing that 8 months ago, initially because she didn't trust the organization's archiving practices, and later because she didn't trust Marco. It had never mattered more than it did right now. Then she went upstairs for her Thursday session and said nothing about what had happened. She lasted 4 more weeks. 4 weeks of documents delayed, data obscured, credit taken for her work in the weekly briefings she wasn't invited to. 4 weeks of being a very smart girl. 4 weeks of swallowing the slow, grinding humiliation of being made invisible again by a man who couldn't do what she did and knew it and resented her for it. It ended on a Tuesday. Naturally, it was raining. Adrian called her in early. Not Thursday, but Tuesday, which had never happened before. Felix met her at the back entrance of Carmine's and walked her through a route she'd never used, past the kitchen and up a service staircase to a private room on the 2nd floor that she hadn't known existed. Adrian was standing at the window when she came in. There was someone else in the room, a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed, tense, sitting in a chair against the wall with the controlled stillness of someone who was trying very hard not to look like he was listening. Adrian turned when she entered. "I need the Aldridge projection numbers. The ones from the original model." Rosalie understood immediately. The original model, the one she'd built, was different from the numbers that had gone into the last briefing. She knew, because she had noticed the discrepancy and spent 3 sleepless nights trying to figure out where the variance had come from before she understood that the variance hadn't been an error. "The original model," she said carefully, "shows a $17 million shortfall in the 18-month projection." The room was very quiet. "The numbers that went into the quarterly briefing," she continued, "show a $3 million surplus." Adrian looked at her. Where did the briefing numbers come from? They were submitted under the senior financial officer's signature. She watched him process this. His expression didn't change. That was the thing about Adrian Sorrento. His face was like a very well-maintained surface, smooth and unrevealing. But the pale eyes went very still in a particular way that Rosalie had learned, over 4 months of Thursday sessions, meant that something behind them had shifted decisively. "Do you have documentation of the original model?" he asked. She opened the bag she'd brought with her, the same worn leather bag she carried every day, practical and slightly battered, and entirely wrong for the environment she worked in, and set a bound folder on the table. She had printed the parallel files 3 weeks ago and kept them at home, because she had understood that eventually something like this was going to happen. "Every version, time-stamped," she said, going back to the original build. The man in the chair against the wall made a sound that might have been surprise and might have been something else. Adrian looked at the folder, then at her. "You knew," he said. Not an accusation. More like a man fitting the last piece of a puzzle into place and recognizing the shape of what he'd been looking at. "I suspected," she said. "I didn't have confirmation of the motive until now. And you didn't come to me. I didn't have proof. I had math. The math is different from proof." She paused. "And I'm a very smart girl. I was told to stay in my lane." The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat in. Rain came against the window. Somewhere downstairs, the piano player started something new. "Wait outside," Adrian said. She waited in the hallway for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the time on her phone, because she needed something to look at that wasn't the wall, or the floor, or the dim, carpeted stretch of corridor that smelled like floor wax and expensive wood, and the particular tension of a building where serious things happened quietly. The door opened. Felix came out first, looked at her, and gestured her back in. The man who had been in the chair was gone. Adrian was standing where she'd left him, by the window. He turned when she came back in, and this time something was different about the way he looked at her. Some calibration had shifted, some prior assessment been quietly revised and restated. "Marco Bellini has been relieved," he said. Quiet, certain, final. Rosalie absorbed this. "I see. Your reporting structure now goes directly to me. Yes. That works. You'll need an office that isn't a converted storage room. She almost said something about how the storage room was fine, that she didn't need much space, that she didn't want to cause inconvenience. All the reflexive language of a woman who had spent decades shrinking herself to fit the space she was allotted. She stopped before the words came out. Something with more than one window would be preferable, she said instead. He looked at her. For just a fraction of a second, that ghost of a smile lived in his face again. Done, he said. She should have gone back to work. She had a backlog of restructured files to reconstruct from her parallel archive, 2 outstanding projections to rebuild from scratch, and the comprehensive task of auditing everything Marco's hands had touched for the past year. She had an enormous amount of work to do, and she was extremely good at it, and she should have simply gone back downstairs and started. Instead, she said, "He called me a very smart girl." She didn't know why she said it. It came out the same way the I know had come out months ago, at a different table, unrouted, unfiltered, just true. Adrian was quiet for a moment. "He was afraid of you," Adrian said. "Mediocre men always dress their fear up as condescension. It's more comfortable." Rosalie looked at him. The rain kept coming against the window. Somewhere in her chest, something that had been wound very tight for a very long time shifted, just slightly, like a spring releasing one coil. "I should get back to work," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should." She was at the door when he said her name. Not done. Her name. Rosalie. She turned. "You saved this organization a significant amount of money, and then kept the evidence in your bag for 3 weeks waiting for the right moment," he said. "That kind of patience is either very cold or very brave." "Is there a difference?" she asked, the ghost of a smile again, more present this time, almost real. "Not in my experience," he said. She went back to work. The next 6 weeks were the most productive of her career, with a direct line to Adrian and a real office. Second floor, 2 windows, afternoon light that fell across her desk in a way that made the spreadsheet slightly less bleak. She rebuilt the Aldridge projections from scratch, untangled 14 months of Marco's manipulations, and identified 3 additional structural vulnerabilities that had been quietly accumulating, while everyone had been paying attention to the wrong things. Adrian reviewed everything she sent him, usually within the hour, with marginal notations in a handwriting that was surprisingly legible for someone she had categorized as broadly terrifying. He didn't compliment her work. He asked questions, pushed back on assumptions, demanded she defend her reasoning when she was right, which was most of the time. He updated his position without making a production of it. When she caught something he'd missed, which happened twice, he acknowledged it with the same directness. It was the most intellectually honest working relationship she had ever had with anyone. And it was making it extremely difficult for her to maintain the careful, professional distance she had decided was essential for her continued survival in the Sorrento organization. She noticed, without entirely meaning to, that he had started scheduling their sessions for evenings rather than afternoons. She noticed that the kitchen at Carmine's had started sending up food she hadn't ordered. Good food, the kind from the actual menu rather than the staff meal. When she worked late, she noticed that Felix, who had always been courteous in a neutral, professional way, had started escorting her to the parking garage personally at the end of the night. She noticed, and she filed it, and she did absolutely nothing about any of it, because she was 31 years old, and she had watched beautiful, elegant women in fitted dresses move through this world, and she knew with perfect, bone-deep certainty which women men like Adrian Sorrento noticed, and which ones they didn't, and she had long ago made her peace with which category she occupied. She was wrong about that. She found out on a Wednesday. The man's name was Garrett Wynn. He was a mid-level associate connected to the Falcone family out of Detroit. Not a Sorrento ally, not quite an enemy. Occupying that gray zone of organized crime political geography, where allegiances shift on a quarterly basis, and everyone is politely cordial right up until they aren't. He came into Carmine's on a Wednesday evening, when the dining room was moderately full, and Rosalie was crossing through to get to the side staircase, carrying a stack of files, not watching where she was going, because she was reviewing a figure in her head, and the figure wasn't adding up. She walked directly into Garrett Wynne. The files went everywhere. She went back a step, grabbed the edge of a nearby hostess stand, to avoid going down entirely, and looked up into the face of a man who was already looking at her with the particular expression she had catalogued 1,000 times over the course of her life. The quick assessment, the instant categorization, the decision rendered before she'd had time to say a word. "Watch it, sweetheart," Garrett Wynne said. He looked her over with something between amusement and contempt. "They let you wander around in here? Thought this place had standards." The dining room went very slightly quieter in the way that rooms do when something is about to happen, and the room itself knows it before the people in it do. Rosalie crouched down and began collecting her files. Her face was warm, her hands were steady. She had learned a long time ago that giving men like this a reaction was exactly what they wanted, and she refused to give him the satisfaction. "My apologies," she said evenly, stacking pages. "I wasn't looking where I was going." "Obviously," he said. He turned back to his companion and said something low that made the other man laugh. She had all the files. She straightened up. "Miss Dunn." The voice came from across the dining room, quiet, precise, carrying exactly as far as it needed to carry and no further. Everyone heard it. Rosalie turned. Adrian was standing near the entrance to the private corridor, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. It was very still and very cold, and had the quality of a barometric drop, the kind of stillness that precedes something significant. He crossed the dining room without hurrying. He moved the way he always moved, with that unhurried certainty that made space for itself. He stopped beside Rosalie and didn't look at Garrett Wynne right away. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Quiet. Direct. Fine," she said. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "You were working," he said, as if that settled the question of fault entirely. Then he looked at Garrett Wynne. Garrett. Wynne had the sense to look slightly less comfortable than he had a moment ago. "Adrian. Didn't know she was with your operation." "She's not with my operation," Adrian said. "She is my operation." He let the silence sit for a moment, doing the work that his voice didn't need to do. "You'll want to apologize." Wynne glanced at Rosalie, then back at Adrian, and made the rapid calculation of a man who understood exactly how much political capital he was risking and exactly how much he didn't have to spend. "My apologies," he said to Rosalie. "I was out of line." "Thank you," Rosalie said. Her voice was perfectly even. She was very proud of that. Wynne and his companion excused themselves with the particular speed of men who have decided that a different restaurant was what they'd wanted all along. The dining room exhaled. The pianist started again. Adrian turned back to Rosalie. "Come upstairs," he said. "I want to go over the Pemberton numbers before you leave." She followed him up the staircase, through the corridor, into the office with 2 windows. He sat down across from her and opened the file she'd sent him that afternoon. For 4 minutes, they talked through the Pemberton account. He had 2 questions. She had the answers. He made his notations. Then he closed the file and looked at her and said, "How long has it been happening?" She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Always," she said. "It's always been happening. It's not personal." "It is personal," he said. "Everything that happens to people who work for me is personal to me." He paused. "And you don't just work for me." The room was very quiet. The evening light had faded, and the lamp on the desk made the room feel smaller, closer, the paperwork receding to the background. "What do I do then?" Rosalie asked. She meant it as a practical question. She genuinely wasn't sure what category she occupied in the architecture of his life. Adrian looked at her across the desk, at the ink stain on her index finger, at the glasses she'd pushed up into her hair when she started reading, at the slightly battered leather bag on the floor beside her chair, at the quiet, contained quality of a woman who had learned to hold herself carefully in a world that had never offered her much room. "You're the only person in this organization, in any room I walk into, who tells me the truth without calculating the cost first," he said. "Do you understand how rare that is?" "I calculate everything," she said. "I just decided a long time ago that the cost of lying isn't worth the overhead." "That," he said, with something in his voice she couldn't quite categorize, "is exactly what I mean." She should have deflected. She should have nodded professionally and picked up her bag and said something about getting back to the numbers. She had about 45 good deflection options available to her, and she had deployed most of them over the past several months with reliable success. Instead, she said, "You should know that I'm aware that I don't fit the profile of the people you typically—" She paused, choosing the word, "regard." "What profile is that?" "You know what profile." She wasn't going to make him spell it out. She wasn't going to sit in this room and describe herself the way she'd been described her entire life. I don't look like." She stopped. Adrian watched her. He had that stillness that wasn't patience. He waited. "I have been very careful," Rosalie said, "precise, not to misread this situation." "And what situation do you think you've been carefully not misreading?" "The one where a powerful man is generous to a useful employee, and the employee makes the mistake of thinking it means something personal." The silence that followed was different from the other silences in the evening. It had more weight. "Rosalie," Adrian said, "I rearranged the entire organizational structure of this operation to give you a direct reporting line. I moved your office. I had the kitchen send you dinner for the past 6 weeks, because you were working until midnight, and I knew you wouldn't stop to eat otherwise." He paused. "I had Garrett Wynne apologize in the middle of a full dining room. I don't do those things for useful employees." She sat with that for a moment. "You could have mentioned this earlier," she said. "You would have filed it and done nothing about it," he said. "I was waiting for you to finish being afraid." That landed somewhere in her chest with the precision of a very well-placed piece of information. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I was being practical." "You were being afraid and calling it practical. You're very good at that." He said it without cruelty, just with the same directness he brought to everything. "You've spent your whole career being the smartest person in the room and making yourself small enough that no one felt threatened by it. You built yourself an armor made of invisibility, and you got so good at wearing it that you started believing it was your natural shape. The accuracy of it was almost offensive. "You've thought about this a great deal," she said. "I think about you a great deal," he said. "Quiet. Certain." The same voice he used for everything, which somehow made it more true rather than less. Rosalie took off her glasses entirely and set them on the desk between them. Without them, the room was slightly soft at the edges. And Adrian Sorrento was watching her, with those pale silver eyes, and the ghost of a smile had become an actual thing, present and real on his face, and it changed him completely. Made him look like a man rather than a monument, which was somehow much more frightening. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not going to become someone who defers to you professionally because of whatever this is personally." "I know," he said. "That's not something I'd want. And if you ever call me a smart girl, I'll restructure your Cyprus holdings so aggressively that the resulting audit will take 6 years to untangle." He almost laughed. She could see it, the laugh almost making it through the architecture of a face that had forgotten how. It didn't quite, but it came closer than anything had in a long time. "Understood," he said. She picked up her glasses and her bag. She stood up. He stood up. They were on opposite sides of a desk covered in paperwork that represented the complex, sometimes violent, frequently illegal financial architecture of one of Chicago's most powerful criminal organizations, and it was the most ordinary moment she had ever stood inside. "I'll have the Pemberton summary ready Friday morning," she said. "Take Thursday off," he said. "You've worked 23 consecutive days." "I've counted them," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been counting them too." She walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame. "Rosalie," he said. She turned. He was still standing on his side of the desk, and the lamplight made him look entirely human, which was the most dangerous thing about him she had discovered yet. "You've been the center of this organization for 4 years," he said. "I should have seen it from the beginning. I should have told you before now." She had spent 4 years being invisible. 4 years being the numbers lady, the smart girl, the one who did the work and took up too much space and not enough credit. She had built her armor incrementally, piece by careful piece, and she had worn it so long she had begun to believe it was skin. She looked at Adrian Sorrento, crime lord and careful man, standing in the lamplight with something genuine in his face. "You see it now," she said. "That's enough." She walked out. In the hallway, in the quiet, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of standing still, with her hand pressed flat against the wall and her heart doing something complicated and entirely unbudgeted for. Then she straightened her blazer, picked up her bag more securely on her shoulder, and went downstairs to finish her calculations. She was, after all, extraordinarily good at her job, and for the first time in 4 years, she walked through the dining room of Carmine's without making herself small to cross it. She walked the way she walked when no one was watching, her full weight, her real pace, her actual self taking up exactly the space she occupied. No one had ever told her that was allowed. She decided she didn't need to be told.